As is often the case over the course of the Ukrainian war, as events accelerate on the ground, reports in the media about what is actually happening often dwindle to a standstill. As I've said in the past, I think that to the extent that most of these reports come from Russian reporters, the reason for that is probably that they're told by the Russian officials on the ground that with operations taking a sensitive course, the moment has come for them to hold back what they're saying. So the result is that we have a period of sometimes stretching an hour, a couple of hours, sometimes a whole day, sometimes more than a day, when we get very little news, and then the news comes cascading in large doses, and it becomes something of a stress to try to assimilate it all and to try to distinguish fiction from fact. Anyway, the last couple of hours have been quiet in terms of reporting of what is going on the battlefields, but that they are not actually quiet, that in fact the fighting is going on at the same level of intensity and might even be intensifying further, at least in the critical area of Bakhmut. Well, that is suggested to me by a report from Reuters. Now, Reuters' report reads as follows. It says, Russians tighten noose on Ukraine's Bakhmut, situation extremely tense. The words extremely tense being in quotation marks. And we go on to read, Russian forces on Tuesday pressed forward their weeks-long drive to encircle and capture the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, where the commander of Ukraine's ground forces described the situation as extremely tense. And that's a quote, obviously, from him. The Russian troops, including mercenary fighters from the Wagner group, are trying to cut the Ukrainian defenders' supply lines to the city, scene of some of the war's bloodiest battles, and force them to surrender or withdraw. That would give Russia its first major prize in more than a year and a half and open the way to the capture of the last remaining urban centers in the Donetsk region, one of four which Moscow claims to have annexed in what it calls its special military operation. Now, notice, by the way, that this particular report from Reuters, somewhat walks back the common claim that you see in the Western media about Bakhmut having no strategic significance. We read that its capture by the Russians would, to quote Reuters, open the way to the capture of the last remaining urban centers in the Donetsk region. So it turns out that Bakhmut is indeed extremely important, as I've discussed in previous programs on this channel, as has been discussed by my colleague Alex Christoforou and I on the Duran, as multiple other people like Big Serge, the blogger, Simplicius, the thinker, another blogger, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, Douglas McGregor, all of these people have been saying Bakhmut is in fact extremely important indeed. And it is in fact, if you like, the lock on the gate of the remaining Ukrainian positions in Donbass, in Donetsk region. If Bakhmut falls, well, I want to stress again, I'm not suggesting that Donetsk will immediately fall under Russian control. There will no doubt be weeks, perhaps months of heavy fighting. But the momentum will be clearly with the Russians. They will possess the high ground, or so it seems, and the Ukrainians will be thrown back to their very last defense line in Donbass, the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka area. And with nothing behind, it might be a particularly difficult line to hold, more difficult than the current Zelensky line from Seversk, which used to pass through Soledar onto Bakhmut itself. Anyway, to continue with the Reuters report. We now have the quotation, the full quotation from the commander of Ukraine's ground forces. Despite significant losses, the enemy threw in the most prepared assault units of Wagner, who are trying to break through the defences of our troops and surround the city. Ukraine's Colonel General Oleksandr Syrsky said in a statement. And we then get the eyewitness report. An unnamed soldier from Ukraine's 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade speaking on the Telegram messaging app as explosions boomed in the background, struck a defiant note. February 28th, the town of Bakhmut, the city is on fire, the enemy is pressing, everything will be Ukraine. And we then go on to read, and all this is from Reuters, Russia's state-run RIA news agency released a video clip which it said showed Russian Sukhoi-25 fighter jets. Actually, they're not fighters, they're bombers, but never mind. Sukhoi-25 jets roaring over Bakhmut. We are glad they are ours, says a man in the clip, identified as a Wagner fighter, adding the jets help them psychologically. So there we go. And we have more reports from Reuters about the fighting in Bakhmut. Ukraine's military said Russia was shelling settlements around Bakhmut, which had a pre-war population of around 70,000, but now lies in ruins after months of intense trench warfare. Over the past day, our soldiers repelled more than 60 enemy attacks, the military said early on Tuesday, including on the villages of Yadidne and Berkhova, just north of Bakhmut. Well, of course, the Russians claim that they've captured those two villages, and they provided photographic evidence which appears to confirm that they have. But here we see Ukraine denying that these two villages have been captured, just as they haven't yet admitted that Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovievka, further north, have also been captured by the Russians. And then we have the last piece. It's actually quite ominous. It says, a Reuters reporter who visited the area on Monday said he saw no sign of Ukrainian forces withdrawing and that reinforcements were arriving despite constant Russian shelling. And that's from Reuters. Now, the last paragraph I find especially ominous, all the more so as there had been some reports over the last couple of hours that President Zelensky has finally agreed to the supposed urgent advice of his military staff to pull forces back from Bakhmut. But a Reuters reporter on the ground says, on the contrary, that more reinforcements, Ukrainian reinforcements, are arriving in Bakhmut, despite the fact that the situation, well, I won't call it a collapse. The Ukrainians are still putting up what is clearly an organised resistance. But despite the fact that the fighting is now going very badly wrong for Ukraine, nonetheless, Ukraine continues to send more troops, still more troops, into what both sides now refer to as the Bakhmut meat grinder. I have to say I am lost in bafflement as well as horror about this decision, but it seems to be some sort of decision that the Ukrainians are fixated on following. And I have to say this, we always get these reports that General Zaluzhny, perhaps also General Syrsky, are coming along and telling Zelensky to withdraw their Ukrainian troops from Bakhmut. Zelensky always supposedly says no. I think that advice is being given at some level, but it is remarkable given the horror that is playing out in Bakhmut and given that we actually know that senior American military officers have advised that Bakhmut should be abandoned, and that the German intelligence agency, the BND, has apparently recommended the same thing, and that was weeks ago, that Ukraine continues to do the opposite. It continues to pour more men into the meat grinder. And the fact that it does this makes me wonder about what the real motivation of these officers, these senior officers, Zaluzhny and Syrskyi and the others, actually is. And it also makes me wonder also about the decision, which I discussed briefly yesterday, to sack the general in command of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. Could it be that the reason this general has been sacked is not because he's being set up as the scapegoat, though I suspect that will follow before very long, but perhaps because this particular general, who's the person closest to the events on the actual battlefronts, is becoming sickened by the slaughter and has been remonstrating with increasing energy to his senior commanders, to Zaluzhny and Syrskyi, and perhaps to Zelensky himself, begging them to pull Ukrainian forces out of Bakhmut, to stop sacrificing Ukrainian lives in this way, in a town that cannot be held for much longer. And perhaps that's why he was sacked. Perhaps that's the real, true reason for his sacking. I don't want to discuss this further. There's a limit to how much and how far one can speculate about such things. But anyway, we see Reuters talking about the Ukrainians reinforcing in Bakhmut, no sign of any retreat there. And I wonder whether the generals come along, go through the motions of putting to Zelensky the suggestion that Ukraine should retreat, and then when he refuses, they willingly follow his orders and send more men into the meat grinder to die. And I wonder whether that is actually, in fact, their policy, whether that is what they want to see happen, not in the sense that they want men to die, but that they are ultimately as committed as Zelensky is himself to holding every millimeter of ground that Ukraine has, and that they are as unwilling in the end, in the final analysis, to carry out withdrawals as Zelensky is. If so, then the generals are presumably hiding behind Zelensky. They're sort of coming along and giving him advice, which they're not pressing and which they know he will refuse, because that gives them, if you like, a kind of cover, a kind of insurance. So if things do finally go wrong, well, they can come forward and say, well, it's not really our fault that tens of thousands of men have died defending an undefendable position. It is all the fault of the politician, of Zelensky, who didn't follow our advice. Now, I say all of this because some days ago I did get a very, very interesting, very revealing email from somebody who has a military background, which of course, as I've discussed many times, I don't. And he suggested that one of the reasons why the Russians are willing to withdraw from undefendable positions is because they know they can take them back. They have massive resources piling up behind them. They outnumber the Ukrainians now on the actual battlefronts, and they massively outnumber the Ukrainians in tanks, guns, every other conceivable machine that you can think of. So they are willing to pull back from places like Izium, Balaklia, Kupiansk, because they know that eventually, at some point, they will take it back. Same, obviously, being true about Kherson region. Whereas Ukraine, with its increasing weapons problems, the depletion of its manpower resources, it holds on grimly to all these places because, on the contrary, they know deep down that if they lose them, they cannot take them back. They cannot take back Donbass. They understand that a counteroffensive to recapture Donbass, for all the brave words that Ukrainian officials sometimes come up with, is unachievable. And at the same time, they don't want to lose Donbass. It's, for them, essential to maintain morale in their own country, but also, of course, and as I've discussed already, because Donbass is Ukraine's shield. The particular topography of Donbass, its many towns and factories and railway lines and roads and the heavy, huge fortifications that were built up there, they don't exist to the same extent anywhere else in Ukraine. They can't be reproduced elsewhere, except perhaps in one or two places, like perhaps the Kiev conurbation, Kharkov perhaps. But it's difficult to reproduce this kind of geography, and they know that if Donbass falls, the rest of Ukraine will be wide open. Well, there have also been reports that the generals have been doing something which I personally find very disturbing and very cynical and very callous, even though I accept there might be a kind of brutal military calculus behind it. The word is, and we've discussed this in several videos, that they've pulled out the best troops from Bakhmut, that the people they send to replace them are recently called up reservists, often with minimal training. I've seen them referred to in some media outlets as meat, which I have to say I find extremely disturbing. And I wonder whether Ukrainian commanders really do think of them in that kind of way. But anyway, there are men, often older or younger men, who are thrown into battle without extensive training in order to hold positions and to buy time whilst Ukraine supposedly builds up its forces in the rear. Except the very latest report suggests that things have gone so badly wrong for Ukraine in northern Bakhmut that the Ukrainians have been forced to redeploy some of their best troops to try to stabilize positions there, though in this apparently they've not been successful. So it looks as if Ukraine is only up to a certain point able to do that which has been suggested it is trying to do. As I said, husband its best troops in the rear and sacrifice the rest. I have to say, if that is Ukraine's tactic, I find it unbearably callous, but it seems it might not be working anyway. Events are now moving beyond Ukraine's control, beyond Ukraine's ability to dictate the terms upon which it fights, given that it insists on trying to defend places like Bakhmut. Now, that's perhaps where we should understand a rather curious report that came out the other day, and which was, to some extent perhaps, corroborated by Prigozhin, though I have to say straight away I'm very skeptical about it, but there's been some reports that some of the Leopard 2 tanks, which Ukraine has hurriedly provided to Poland has hurriedly provided to Ukraine, have now turned up in Chasov Yar. Now we're talking about something like 14 tanks that Poland has provided. It's not clear what proportion of these tanks have actually been supplied to Ukraine. The Poles have said that these tanks are already in Ukraine, and if these reports are to be believed, and I'm not sure they are, then they've already found their way to Chasov Yar. Now, Chasov Yar is, of course, the town immediately to the west of Bakhmut, the next target, if you like, on the Russian menu, once they've perhaps either finished Bakhmut or as part of their encirclement operations. So if the Ukrainians are sending Leopard 2s to Chasov Yar, then they're doing exactly the opposite of what the Americans have advised them to do, to hold back the new equipment that they're getting before they, until they're properly trained to use it, to hold it back and to husband all this new equipment in preparation for this spring offensive that we've been hearing so much about. Now, I have to say, if this is indeed what's happening, then it looks as if that plan is also being overtaken by events, and far from husbanding the new tanks that Ukraine is receiving, Ukraine is losing them in penny packets. Now, I don't want to push this too far because, as I've said already, I don't know how reliable this report is. Prigozhin, as I said, seemed to think that that was the case, but perhaps he's wrong. Anyway, this is the situation in Bakhmut. There's been less information about what's going on the other battle lines. But I did see a rather interesting map from a Ukrainian source about the fighting in Avdiivka. This is this big, fairly big town, about 30,000 people, adjacent to Donetsk city. You could call it a suburb of Donetsk city. Ukraine has been in control of it since 2015. It's been very heavily fortified. That is where most of the biggest part of the Ukrainian forces, close to Bakhmut, are located. Anyway, a Ukrainian official who has some sort of civilian role in this town, Avdiivka, says that Russian shelling is going on round the clock and that the Russians are now pressing around Avdiivka very hard. And a Ukrainian map, which I saw, showed a picture not entirely unlike that in Bakhmut of a north and south pincer movement around Avdiivka, the Russians carrying out a creeping encirclement of Avdiivka, rather like the one they're supposedly carrying out. Well, they are in fact carrying out in Bakhmut. Now, I have to say straight away that we have far less information about what's going on in Avdiivka than we do in Bakhmut, and I'm not going to say more about that. But if Bakhmut, the fall of Bakhmut, opens up the way for the Russians to advance on Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, as the Reuters dispatch I just read from, essentially admits putting in jeopardy the entire Ukrainian position in north and central Donbass, then the fighting around Donetsk city, in Avdiivka, in Marinka, in Vuhledar, where the Russians again claim that they're on the offensive. Well, the fighting in and around these places has the potential to collapse Ukrainian positions in southern Donbass, and by the way, in Zaporozhye as well, if, of course, the Russians are successful and are eventually able to capture all of these places, as I'm sure eventually they will. Anyway, that's perhaps all I can say for the moment about the situation on the battlefronts. Meanwhile, the missile and drone wars continue, and yesterday it was Ukraine's turn, and the Ukrainians again launched drones aimed at targets deep into Russia. And one drone in particular seems to have been aimed at Moscow. This is something new, by the way, though it was shot down near the important Russian town or city of Kolomna, and apparently something about 100 miles from, or kilometers rather, from Moscow. So it didn't actually get to Moscow, though it was heading towards Moscow. This was, from the pictures I've seen, a relatively small drone. Apparently has an 800-kilometer range, but we see that the Ukrainians do seem to have made some kind of an attack on Moscow. There are reports that Ukraine carried out at least 2 more drone strikes, or attempted to carry out at least 2 more drone strikes, and one of them seems to have been with a converted Strij drone. These are these old Soviet jet-powered drones that Ukraine has converted into cruise missiles, something which the Russians say, by the way, Ukraine would not have been able to do by itself. It must have had Western assistance to do it, perhaps from Britain or from the United States. And it seems these 2 converted drones, cruise missiles if you prefer, that the Russians were able to bring them both down. And interestingly, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims that these 2 drones were brought down not by shooting them down, but through electronic warfare means. I'm not going to guess too much about how that was done. The Russians are known to be extremely advanced in electronic warfare. They're known to have a particular skill and experience in this type of warfare, and they appear to have used some method of jamming, presumably, to jam the control mechanisms of these 2 converted drones and to bring them both down. One drone does seem to have come very close to its target, however, which was some kind of fuel depot, but it was brought down before it reached the fuel reservoirs, the fuel cylinders themselves. So it did limited damage. So overall, an unsuccessful series of drone attacks. There have been some murmurings. There's been some curious events in St. Petersburg. The airport at Pulkovo, which is the international airport near to St. Petersburg, has been closed for much of the day because of the presence, or so the Russians say, of an unidentified object. It's not exactly clear what's happened, whether Ukraine tried some kind of a drone attack in that direction as well, or whether this is just somebody taking excessive precautions, or perhaps taking valid precautions, but ones that don't necessarily prove an actual drone attack. No doubt we'll be getting a lot more information about what happened over the next couple of hours. But anyway, for the moment, as I said, it doesn't seem as if this drone attack on Russia itself, was particularly successful. But it is interesting that Ukraine is trying ever harder to launch strikes deep into Russian territory, even as far as Moscow. The Russians clearly expected this. As I said, they've had their electronic warfare systems deployed, and a few weeks ago we saw Panzer systems deployed on the roofs of important public buildings in Moscow. So the Russians are, of course, fully aware of what the Ukrainians are trying to do, and they seem to be prepared at least for these attacks, which for the moment are not getting through. I don't know how far and to what extent Ukraine can press home these attacks. My guess is that they can continue these attacks at least for some time, and it's possible that one cruise missile, or perhaps more, perhaps a few of them, will eventually penetrate Russian defenses. And of course they might hit a civilian target, perhaps an apartment building in Moscow itself. Be interesting to see, by the way, how, if that happens, the Western media will report it. I'm sure Ukraine itself will deny that it had any role in the attack, which is what Ukraine routinely does in relation to targets in Russia. For the record, if that happens, I think it will only harden Russian public opinion. I was personally in Moscow at the time when I'm going to call them insurgents, terrorists if you prefer, from the Caucasus, planted bombs in the Moscow metro. And I can say straight away that my experience being in Moscow at that time, this was in the 2000s, was that far from weakening Russian resolve to see the conflict in the Caucasus resolved on Russian terms, it hardened it. And I suspect the same would be true in the event that Ukraine succeeds in any drone strikes on Moscow itself. I would say that I don't know how accurate these drones or converted cruise missiles Ukraine is using actually are. I'm going to guess not especially accurate, in which case damage to a civilian target is a real possibility. Now, yesterday there were lots and lots of reports about some kind of drone strike on an airfield in Belarus, with claims that an A-50U Russian AWACS aircraft had been damaged on in the airfield, and this attack was supposedly carried out by Belarusian partisans. I made very clear my deep skepticism about that claim. Note that just a few hours after that attack, we've seen Ukrainian drone and, if you like, missile strikes deep into Russia. And I can't help but think that this is not chance. What we're seeing is Ukraine trying to launch some kind of counter missile and drone strike upon Russia and upon Russian military positions. And there was this attack yesterday on this airfield in Belarus, and there was an attack on positions in Russia today, including one missile that came close to Moscow. So this is part of the same sequence of attacks. And I think that we can confidently dispense with the idea that this attack on that airfield in Belarus was therefore the work of Belarusian partisans. I have never really taken it very seriously, and we see that the sequence of events that's happened since then argues against that. What we have had no information about at all from any source is about whether that drone attack on that Belarusian air base actually did damage or destroy anything. Now, the Belarusian authorities yesterday denied that there'd been a drone attack from Ukraine. I think they did that because President Lukashenko, who is, by the way, now in Beijing, had previously said that if there was an attack from Ukraine, Belarus would respond fiercely. And I think that he didn't want to be put in a position where he was pushed into making that kind of response, which he threatened to make at a time not his choosing. So he's downplayed the drone attack on the Belarusian airbase by simply denying that there have been any drones launched towards Belarus by Ukraine. But anyway, we've not had any information about what damage these drones, if they did exist, which they probably did, actually did do to this airbase. And I have to say, I'm getting now an accumulation of claims that the drones, the Belarusian drones, were all shot down and that they didn't do any actual damage to the airbase or to the aircraft there at all. Against that, there is some reports that they damaged a snowplow on the airfield, and they did a certain amount of damage to one Russian aircraft, which of course could have been this AWACS aircraft that we've been talking about. Well, until photographic evidence is produced about what actually happened at this airbase, it's impossible to say. I've been waiting for satellite photos. So far, none have appeared. Perhaps they will over the next couple of days or weeks. If nothing ever does appear, I will conclude that the drones were indeed shot down and that no real harm or damage was done. So there we go. Ukrainian attacks or Ukrainian missile strikes on Russia. Ukrainians trying to hit targets deep inside Russia. Not so far having much success. If they do achieve success, my view is that politically it will have the opposite effect to whatever effect the Ukrainians are hoping for. So, bad news for Ukraine from the battlefields. Perhaps a missile strike on Russia intended more for morale purposes than in order to achieve anything really significant, but a missile strike that appears to have failed. Now, that's, it seems to me, a reasonable summary of the state of the war. Let me go back to President Lukashenko, because he is now, as we know, in China, and he's apparently going to meet, or will shortly be meeting, President Xi Jinping, who of course is planning within the next few weeks to fly to Russia to meet with President Putin there. So, quite a lot going on there. All these sort of diplomatic activity, and note that China is now becoming the center of it. And it's interesting that this is the case, and it does make one wonder increasingly about what exactly is up. What are the Chinese thinking? What are they going to do? They've now outlined all these various position papers. President Lukashenko is in Beijing. He's talked, by the way, rather grandiosely, about merging together the industrial sectors of China, Russia, and Belarus. By the way, that might sound grandiose, but it's quite possibly something that could actually happen. I'm not sure how the Russians would feel about it, but that's another story. But anyway, a major a lot going on, and China is at the center. President Macron is intending to fly to Beijing in April to meet President Xi Jinping. And as I said, President Xi Jinping before that is coming to Moscow. The one person that President Xi Jinping shows no interest in speaking to is President Zelensky of Ukraine. Western officials have apparently asked him to do so, but so far he has, well, I won't say he's declined, but he hasn't done it. So it all seems to center on what the Chinese are preparing to do, and the fact that the Chinese are obviously listening to Lukashenko and about to meet at the highest level with Putin. Well, that tells us that, as I said, lots is going on. We don't quite know what it is. I'm going to guess that it is both a diplomatic initiative that's coming, and I'm also going to guess that, as I said, perhaps some kind of arms or technology deliveries to Russia from China are going to start materializing before very long. Now, what exactly has caused the Chinese to harden up their support for Russia at this particular time? For the moment, it doesn't seem as if the Russians need very much Chinese support. They're on the advance in Donbass. They're close to capturing Bakhmut. Ukraine is suffering horrific losses trying to defend Bakhmut. There's good reasons to think that we have more meat grinders working against Ukraine in Vuhledar, perhaps before long in Avdiivka, and in the Kremenaya-Svatovo area. So the Russians seem to be doing okay on the battlefield. And economically, we've now had a flood of news about the state of Russia's economy, the state of Russia's finances, and they suggest that Russian oil sales are now running at about normal levels, that the discount that the Russians are paying to the Chinese are giving to the Russians, to the Chinese and the Indians for their oil is actually relatively small. I've been reading reports that in North Africa there is an insatiable demand for Russian oil. And there was also a particularly interesting report that there's large numbers of tankers off the coast of Greece, my homeland, filled up with Russian oil, and the oil is transferred from one tanker to another, presumably all mixed with oil from other countries, and it's all eventually heading for the European Union. And I've discussed in the past how the EU's price caps, the G7's price caps on oil and gas, and the EU's sanctions or purported sanctions against imports of Russian oil have in effect been torpedoed by the Europeans themselves, by the Europeans and by the Americans themselves. They've allowed so many loopholes. They've created so many ways round these price caps and these sanctions that, to all intents and purposes, they don't really apply anymore. I'm not saying that they are entirely without effect. The fact that the Russians have to sell oil at a discount, even if it's a small discount, to India and China, means that they're not getting as much money for their oil as they might once have done if there had been no caps and no sanctions. And of course, and much more importantly, the fact that the Europeans must go through this complex game of pretending to impose sanctions and buying their oil from Russia in this roundabout, hole-in-the-corner way. Well, all of that suggests that the price the Europeans are going to be paying for their oil is also going to be higher than it would have been if there had not been these sanctions and these price caps. But anyway, my essential point is that the Russians have found ways round the sanctions. Their economy is stable, inflation is falling, their industrial output is apparently strong. They've found ways of replacing all the various goods and components that they had to import before from the European Union, either from home suppliers, home producers, or by importing them from other places. And I've just been seeing that latest reports suggest that Russian imports of semiconductors from China are now at record levels, and there apparently seems to be no problems or restrictions about importing semiconductors from China. And just to repeat again, it's medium-level semiconductors that the Russians principally need, and they don't seem to be having any problems either producing those themselves, which they do, in probably growing quantities, or importing them from China, and I, by the way, believe from Malaysia as well. And again, there were all kinds of claims recently about how Russia, the fact that they couldn't import the absolute top-end chips meant that they would have to abandon their 5G plans. I have to say, I was reading all about this in the Daily Telegraph, not about Russia and 5G. I was reading an article in the Daily Telegraph about Britain and Europe and 5G. And the article said that basically plans to roll out 5G in Europe have been shelved. It's too expensive. The energy cost is too high for the fact that for 5G, which is very energy intensive apparently, so it's too expensive, and there's perhaps as a result, at a time of economic crisis, there's little take up for it from consumers. So the 5G revolution, whether it's been postponed in Russia or not, apparently is being postponed in Europe as well. And again, the sanctions probably have a part to play in that. For the record, again, I'm confident that regardless of what happens with Taiwan, sanctions and all the rest, both the Chinese and the Russians, but definitely the Chinese, will be producing the highest end chips before very long. But anyway, so no need, it would seem, for the Chinese to come to Russia's rescue at the moment. There's no sign that the Russians are in any great need for Chinese help. Now, the Russians do have weak points. They lack, and I've discussed this many times, they are short of drones. And they do need more drones, and China is the world leader in, well, apart from the United States perhaps, but they're perhaps the biggest user of drones. And it could very well be that the Chinese are going to supply drones to the Russians. It's been pointed out to me by a Chinese viewer, I'm not going to say more than that about him, that China does not in fact use 152 millimeter calibers in its artillery, as I imagined. Apparently they did once, presumably during Mao's time, but for some time now they've converted to 155 millimeter rounds. They probably do still have some old artillery pieces in stock, and they might have some ammunition for them. But as I've said many times, the shelf life of artillery ammunition, though longish, 20 years or so, is not unlimited, and it doesn't follow that all these shells are in a usable condition. Of course, China, with its colossal industrial capacities, could produce 152 millimeter artillery shells, fulfilling all Russian needs, and it could probably get production going very fast. China has colossal amounts of factory space. It has a huge machine tools industry. Perhaps most importantly, it has any number of technicians, people with the knowledge of chemicals, the knowledge of surfaces and materials, to be able to build, to set up a production line and to build these shells in quantity at speeds which no Western economy could match. But I don't think the Chinese are planning to provide Russia with artillery shells. So if it's drones, I can see that there would be a purpose, but again, I've been seeing some more reports that the Russians are actually coming very close now to solving their own problems with drones, and there's been photographs appearing of Orion drones starting to be assembled in the area, the battlefield area. There are some modifications to them, by the way, which suggest a certain redesign, perhaps following battlefield use. So it could be that the Russians might not need those drones very much either. But as I said in my previous video, putting aside whether the Russians need Chinese shells, need Chinese drones, the symbolism of China supplying even limited numbers of weapons to Russia would be colossal. It would demonstrate once and for all to the Western powers that any hope that the West could exhaust Russia, that the Russians will at some point run out of weapons, that is a fantasy and that it will never happen. Well, that still leaves open the question, however, of why the Chinese are making these moves now. And I'm going to suggest that it is certain events coming out of the United States. Now, yesterday, I did a program on iChungqing, which is a channel that's you can find it, a YouTube channel. You could certainly, I would certainly recommend you follow that. It was a panel discussion which involved myself and Alex Christoforou. Anyway, you can see that it's based in China. The person who runs it, Alex, is not Chinese, but anyway, Canadian, I believe. But anyway, it's actually interesting and worthwhile to watch this program. And it discusses at length, our host, Alex, discussed at length and provided clips of an extraordinary meeting that took place in the United States of, I understand, the House Armed Services Committee. And it was 3 hours of talking about the Chinese threat to the United States and of the United States discussing counters to China and talking about war with China at some point in the near future. There wasn't any particular certainty as to when this war would break out, or even really about over what it would break out over, why it would break out. I mean, there's an assumption it's about Taiwan, but maybe there was some discussions going on about that. There was a lot of discussions about that, but it hardly seems a sufficient explanation, given that, as I have said, until very recently, the situation with Taiwan was entirely stable. And it is the United States and the Taiwanese government, not China, that has destabilized the status quo, that has created tensions over Taiwan that had not existed before. There was talk about arming Taiwan to the point where it can fulfill some kind of porcupine defense, for example, which is extraordinarily provocative to China. Well, I'm going to suggest that the Chinese are watching all of this. They will also have been watching the episode of The Balloon, or Balloons. They will be reading the endless commentaries now that are appearing in more and more parts of the American media. They will be listening to the statements of US leaders, including in particular President Biden, and also Secretary Blinken. Blinken seems to have a particular feelings about China. And of course, President Biden burst into that angry exposition over the course of his State of the Union address, when he suddenly, and without obvious reason, demanded rhetorically which world leader would take the place of Xi Jinping. And I think the Chinese are saying to themselves, well, the United States clearly is becoming extremely hostile to us. It's no longer an issue of economics. That we can understand. Trade policy we can understand. We can find ways round. China isn't as dependent on its exports as it once was. It can come to arrangements with the United States. It did so to a great extent during the period of the Trump administration. They can find ways around any issues with trade with the United States. So if it was just a question of a trade dispute, even a bitter trade dispute, that would not be a problem. It is rather the case that more and more people in the United States have convinced themselves that China is the US's enemy. I'm not really sure why, but there we are. And that the United States, or at least the present leadership of the United States, seems to be intent on confronting China in some way. And I think that it is this that has persuaded the Chinese that it's actually in their interests to start becoming more openly supportive of the Russians and more openly involved in Ukraine. There's been an awful lot said about how the United States benefits from a prolonged war in Ukraine. There is a case for saying that the true big beneficiary of a prolonged war in Ukraine is actually China. The United States and its allies are busy depleting their arsenals to try to keep up with the insatiable demands of the Ukraine military. We see how they're failing to do that with ammunition, but ammunition stocks are becoming depleted. The United States is also trying to find ways to supply Ukraine with more advanced weapons, missiles, those kind of things, but it's struggling to do that too. And with every day that this war of attrition in Ukraine continues, the Russians chip away a little further at Ukraine and ultimately at US credibility in Europe. And from the Chinese point of view, just as it suited the Chinese for that the United States became over-involved, over-committed to the Middle East during the War on Terror era, the George W. Bush, Barack Obama era. So it probably suits the Chinese that the United States is now over-invested in Ukraine, is in effect tied down in Ukraine. So the Chinese stirring the pot a little, giving a little more support to the Russians diplomatically, perhaps providing the Russians with some military technology, helping undoubtedly the Russians weather the sanctions by buying Russian oil and providing semiconductors and doing all those things. Well, that suits China at this time, and it suits it very well. The Chinese, by the way, have always successfully capitalized from America's wars. They capitalized from the war in Vietnam. That war, by the way, was originally marketed in the United States as intended to limit Chinese influence. Vietnam was often presented in the 1960s as a satellite of China, and the idea was that if Vietnam prevailed, then that would lead to other East Asian states falling like a row of dominoes, with China being the ultimate winner, that the Chinese would somehow scoop up all these winnings across the Pacific. In fact, that was completely wrong. And in fact, the big winners from the Vietnam War, other than the Vietnamese, by the way, who now have the world's fastest growing economy, or so I believe, the big winners were in fact the Chinese, because the Chinese were able to leverage American involvement in the Vietnam War to bring about the US opening to China, the meetings between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, and Nixon's famous visit to Beijing. Anyway, all of that, which of course set China ultimately on course to the position it occupies today. So the Chinese benefited from the Vietnam War. They benefited from the wars the United States waged in the Middle East. They've benefited from the Ukraine war. In saying all of this, I want to make it very clear that I'm not suggesting in any way that the Chinese willed these wars. on the United States, or that they sought these wars, or that they wanted these wars. On the contrary, my impression is that the Chinese, in every instance, would much rather that those wars hadn't happened. But the wars did happen, not through their choice, and the Chinese very skillfully gained benefits from them. And I think that given the evident hostility to them of the United States, difficult though it is for me fully to understand, the Chinese are now calculating that perhaps it's worth their while not to keep the war in Ukraine going. I think, again, the Chinese probably would say much better to end this war as much as possible. But if there has to be a war in Ukraine, and that's not our choice, well, it suits us in so many ways if the United States remains stuck there. So I suspect this is why the Chinese are making these moves now. They understand that this is now playing out to their advantage, and they're moving to capitalize on this, and that's why we see these diplomatic moves. Wang Yi going to Europe, pointing out to the Europeans that it makes no sense for them to stick with the Americans on these kind of conflicts. They're only the losers, and in the meantime, they're able to strengthen their diplomatic leverage with the Russians, build up their relations with Belarus, position themselves as the party everybody needs to talk to, including, by the way, eventually the Americans themselves, and at the same time keep the United States distracted, over-engaged in Europe in this war, which Barack Obama said was a country where the United States had no strategic interest. This was said in that Atlantic interview of 2016. And one can see why the Chinese might be making those calculations now and might be making those moves. Well, we'll see how this plays out. But one thing I have to say is that when this conflict began, I had assumed that it would be the United States that would be the big beneficiary, that the rapprochement between Germany and Russia had been torpedoed, probably forever, that the Russians had been pushed back from Europe, that NATO had been consolidated. I'm increasingly doubtful that that actually is the case. I'm gradually coming round to the view that the big beneficiary of this war, a war which, to be very clear, they did not seek, that the big beneficiary is going to be China. Now, talking about those wars in the Middle East, we've seen a further big move over the last few days towards bringing that most intractable war of all of those wars, the one in Syria, to an end. And the Egyptian foreign minister has now traveled to Damascus, where he's had an apparently very friendly meeting with President Assad. It's now increasingly clear that Syria is being readmitted into the family of Arab states. The earthquake has made it easier in some ways for the other Arab states, including the Saudis, to reach out to the Syrians. They can say that these moves that they're making are to some extent governed by humanitarian considerations. One should, I think, treat that with a little skepticism in this part of the world, but there it is. And it does seem to me as if most of the Arab states now, in fact, I suspect pretty much all of the Arab states, have come to a collective decision that the war in Syria has run its course and must end, and that Assad has won. And of course, Turkey, also heavily distracted at the moment with the earthquake and with important elections coming in May, may be making the same calculation. And it was interesting that President Erdogan of Turkey telephoned and spoke to President Putin on 2 days, one with an interval between these two telephone calls of just 1 day. So he called Putin, he had a conversation with Putin on the 24th of February, and it was basically all about the earthquake, though there was a discussion about Ukraine. So that was on the 24th of February. And then there was another call, and this one was on the 26th of February, about which we get less information. But the Russians have, as part of their readout of the call, published this message that Putin, this personal message that Putin gave to Erdogan. And I'm taking this now from the Russian readout, and it's Putin to Erdogan. You enjoy well-deserved respect among your fellow countrymen as well as abroad. In these difficult times, in such a critical situation, when Turkey is overcoming the tragic consequences of such devastating earthquakes, your best qualities as a statesman and a person, your courage and ability to make balanced and necessary decisions are in full display. Russia appreciates your personal contribution to strengthening friendly relations and constructive cooperation between our countries. I am confident that moving forward, we will continue to pursue mutually beneficial joint projects and coordinate our efforts to address important issues on the regional and global agenda. So that's Putin, what he thinks of Erdogan, that he's a man of courage and ability, able to make balanced and necessary decisions, the right person to lead Turkey through this crisis over the earthquake. And I have to say that this is clearly Putin giving his support to Erdogan in advance of those difficult elections in May. Quite a risky thing to do, of course, if Erdogan loses, though I suspect that Putin is calculating that Erdogan is almost certainly going to win. Erdogan, for his part, mindful of the fact that something like 70% of people in Turkey apparently have favourable views of Russia and of Putin himself, probably welcomes this message. And I can't help but think that this second telephone call in 3 days was principally intended for Putin to give Erdogan this message so that it can be circulated amongst people in Turkey, particularly within the political and business class, and to show that Erdogan has Putin's support and backing and should therefore remain Turkey's president, and that Erdogan has Putin's high esteem. By the way, I think that is true. I think that at one level, Putin finds Erdogan an extremely difficult person to deal with. I'm sure that there have certainly been some very difficult moments in the relationship between the two men. But I do think that Putin has developed a genuine respect for Erdogan. I think he recognizes that Erdogan is a very strong personality, a very strong leader, and I think he does have a real respect for Erdogan, which gives added weight to these words. So, anyway, I can't help but think also, however, that this statement will have come with something of a request for something from Erdogan in return. And I can't help but think also that whatever that is, it's probably Syrian related, and it is intended to facilitate that meeting between Erdogan and Assad, which I suspect will be the final nail closing the Syrian war, which I suspect we're going to see fairly soon before the Turkish elections in May. Anyway, that's me for the day. That's a roundup of today's news. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video, and don't forget to go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. Last but not least, let me wish you a very good day. Remind you that if you've liked this video, you can press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And thank you once more, and look forward to having you back probably tomorrow. Have a very good day.